There is a point where the usual way of understanding stops feeling sufficient. Not because it is wrong, not because it is broken, but because it begins to feel like it is always arriving slightly after what is being understood. We know how to describe things. We know how to classify them. We know how to explain them using systems that are already in place. But something in the experience of understanding itself begins to feel thinner than what it is trying to grasp. It is not that the knowledge is missing something obvious. It is not that everything it captures seems to arrive already flattened into a form that can be handled. And yet, the world we are trying to understand does not feel flat. So a gap begins to appear, not inside the knowledge itself, but between knowledge and what is being lived. At first, this gap is not noticeable. It is covered by the success of the explanation. For if something can be explained, we assume it is also understood. But slowly that assumption begins to weaken, because explanation does not always close the distance it opens. It can describe a moment of grief without touching the weight of it. It can map a human decision without entering the moment it is made. It can model reality without ever being inside of it. And still everything appears correct. So the question shifts again, but this time more sharply. If everything we know is correct within its system, why does it still feel incomplete at the level of experience? This is where something unusual begins to happen. We start to notice that knowing is not just receiving information. It is an act, a movement. Something happens inside us when we understand something. Before we even have words for it, we lean toward it, we gather it, we hold it together in a certain way so it becomes visible. And this movement is not the same as the system that describes it. No method fully captures it, because every method already assumes it is happening. So now a reversal begins to take shape. We are no longer only looking at knowledge. We are beginning to notice the act of knowing itself, not as psychology, not as behavior, not as brain activity, but as something more basic. Because before anything is defined, measured, or placed into a system, it already appears to us in a certain way. It shows itself, not as an object, but as something that becomes present. And we are always already involved in that appearing before we decide what it is. This is where the tension becomes unavoidable. Because if everything we call knowledge depends on this prior involvement, then knowledge is not the foundation. It is something that comes after. It organizes, it clarifies, it stabilizes. But it does not originate the relation we already have with what appears. And yet we rarely pay attention to this level, because it is not something we can easily turn into a method. It is not something we can easily control, not something we can step outside of and observe as an object. It is closer than that, so close that it is usually invisible, and still everything depends on it. This is the point where the usual direction of thinking begins to shift, because instead of moving outward towards more explanation, more detail, more system, we are now forced into something else, a kind of turning back, not towards ideas, but towards the very movement in which everything and anything becomes intelligible at all. And there something important happens. We can no longer treat understanding as something we simply use. We begin to sense that understanding is something we are already inside of before we do anything with it. And this changes the question entirely. Because if understanding is not something we produce, but something we already find ourselves in, then what exactly is happening when we try to explain it? What kind of activity is it in us that makes anything appear as something meaningful in the first place? We are no longer dealing with knowledge alone, no longer dealing with truth as correctness, no longer even dealing with systems. We are now standing inside the movement that makes all of those possible. And that movement has not yet been named, but it is no longer invisible. And once this becomes even slightly visible, even in a fragile way, another consequence follows. Because if every system depends on a prior way by which things are allowed to appear at all, then the question is no longer only what we know or how we know it. It becomes more unsettling. What do we assume is already given before knowledge begins? And can that assumption ever be fully brought under the control of the systems built upon it? By the time we reach this point, something has already changed in how we look at knowledge. It is no longer just about whether a statement is correct, or whether a model works, or whether a system is efficient. Those things might still matter, of course. They might continue to function. They may even continue to produce results. But underneath them, another question is now quietly present, not as a theory, more like a disturbance in the background. Because if understanding always depends on a prior way in which things are allowed to appear, then every system of knowledge begins somewhere it cannot fully account for. It begins with something it does not produce but depends on, and yet it behaves as if everything begins from within itself. This is where the tension becomes even sharper, because science, in its most successful form, does not ask what makes its own way of seeing possible. It begins after that question has already been set aside. It works within a space that is already assumed to be stable, where things can be measured, observed, described, compared. But what is this space itself? We never ask. Not because the question is forbidden, but because it does not belong to the method. And if a question does not belong to the method, it quietly disappears from what counts as knowledge. So the method continues. It becomes more refined, more precise, more powerful even. It can describe more of the world than ever before. But the more it describes, the more it relies on something it does not. Because in order for anything to be measured, it must already appear as something measurable. In order for anything to be known, it must already be available to knowing. In order for anything to be represented, it must already be present in a form that allows representation. And none of this is produced by the system itself. It is simply assumed. At this point, something else becomes difficult to ignore. The success of the method does not explain its own possibility. It only operates within it. So we begin to notice a strange asymmetry. On the one side, there is extraordinary expansion of what can be calculated, predicted, and controlled. On the other side, there is a complete silence about the ground that makes any of this possible in the first place. And this silence is not accidental, it is structural. Because the moment a method turns back to question its own condition, it stops being a method and becomes something else entirely. So it does not turn back, it continues forward. But in continuing forward, it leaves something behind that it can never fully recover. And this is where the final tension becomes unavoidable. Because if everything that is known depends on something that is not itself known in the same way, then knowledge is always slightly displaced from what allows it to be. It arrives after the fact. It organizes what has already appeared. It works on what is already given, but it does not generate the giving itself. And yet we speak as if it does. This is why the system feels complete from the inside. It has no need to look beyond itself in order to function. But from another perspective, something very simple becomes visible. It is always operating inside something it does not touch. Not because it is incomplete, but because its completion depends on not asking that question. So we are left with a very specific kind of tension, a form of intelligence that expands everything it touches without ever encountering the source of its own possibility. And this brings us to our initial question: does science think? Let us put it in this way. If everything that is produced as knowledge depends on a prior openness it does not create itself, what exactly is it doing when it calls itself thinking?